You really do have to look at this as a two-sided market. First and foremost, you want to make sure that your customers, or as you have more and more partners and integrators, your mutual joint customers, that the customers are winning, that you're solving for the joint customer need, because that is the engine, that keeps these things growing. But it's equally important to recognize that your partners, they're almost a kind of customer as well too. You really need to be in the mindset of how do I make my partners successful?
Today I'm excited to have in our show Scott Brinker, famous chief MarTech, who is mapping marketing technology ecosystem and its growth from hundreds of products 10 years ago to 10,000 products today, which is incredible. On top of that, Scott is VP of Platform Ecosystem in HubSpot. And HubSpot is an amazing company which transformed itself into a platform over the last 5 years. And Scott has been leading this transformation. I had a chance to ask him about learnings that he got transforming HubSpot into platform. What are the things that you might need to pay attention if you aspire to do the same? What underlying drivers that drive technology markets to grow as fast as it does? And what does the future holds? Because companies like IDC predict to have hundreds of millions of apps in a few years. Without further ado, Scott Brinker. Hi, Scott. I was really excited about this interview, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here with you, Roman.
So you are one of the global experts in marketing technology. You've been mapping marketing ecosystems since it was a little bit more than 100 marketing tools, and now you just announced a new landscape, which is 100 times that, right? It's like around 10K.
Yeah, it's about 10,000 that we mapped, but yeah, we know there's many more out there that we didn't put on the map. So yeah, it's been several orders of magnitude change over the past decade.
Exactly. And then you also VP of Platform Ecosystem in HubSpot. And again, you sort of started this at the time when ecosystem was really not understood term, and now everyone is talking about ecosystem, and you led transformation of HubSpot, which was marketing tech suite, I would say, into like genuine platform, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying that mission, and I would say the mission is not complete. It is a journey. We are still on that journey. We've got further to go, but as we talk about what HubSpot's doing, it is also very relevant to like just the changes we see across the broader marketing tech landscape.
Finally, you are probably one of the few people who can like clearly explain what is happening in technology in a simple terms, and this is what I really hope we're going to be doing in the next half an hour or so. And let's start with marketing landscape. You just announced 10,000 marketing stack. Why it's still growing 20% year over year? And what do you see as the key trends? Where's consolidation? Where is the energy in marketing stack today?
Like every year that we've done this, and the landscape keeps expanding, I think one of the most common questions people have is like, well, wait, I don't understand. Why is this still growing? Because all the time in the news, I'm reading about, these acquisitions and this company acquires this other one. It would seem like there is consolidation happening in MarTech. So why does this landscape keep growing? And what makes things interesting is both things are true. There is consolidation happening in the industry. The way I think of it is the MarTech landscape is like a long tail, and so the head of the tail has some very large companies, Salesforce, Adobe, Microsoft, Oracle, HubSpot's, making our play in there. But then, you quickly go down this, long tail where there's all these new startups, whether they are companies that someday hope to challenge the leaders and become part of the head themselves, or these like almost, some of them are micro SaaS, but like these really specialized tools that they do something very specific, either for a specific industry or a specific channel or a specific geographical region. And that's where we see this like just incredible diversity. So yes, the landscape has a lot of apps, a lot of vendors that are in it, but if you were to look at the distribution of the size of those different companies, it would start to feel a little bit like, oh, okay, now I get it. There's these, very large companies, there's some relatively large companies, and then there's like, yeah, a whole string of small companies. And I think this is one of the perennial challenges in the marketing technology industry is how do we make this work? And this is what led me to the work I do at HubSpot with platform ecosystem. It's almost like, if you think of things like the iPhone or Android, these are highly consolidated platforms. In fact, you could say there's really only two, like mobile, platforms out there. But because of the consolidation of those two platforms, they've enabled this, just incredible blossoming of millions, of specialized apps that plug into those platforms. And while I don't think the B2B MarTech industry is quite there, we'll probably maybe never get to that scale. It feels like that's kind of the similar pattern that we're looking for. Is we want to have these very common, stable, large platforms, but then we want to be able to plug into those, a range of highly specialized apps, for things that are a little bit more unique to our business.
Previewing something that we're gonna jump later on, do you see the biggest growth happening within some ecosystem like HubSpot or Salesforce ecosystem, for example, like companies sort of building on other platforms, or do you see it's elsewhere?
There are certainly some apps that are built for a specific platform. Like there are some companies who have built apps specifically for HubSpot. There's a number of companies that have built apps specifically for Salesforce. But I would say the most common pattern we see is companies that are building, it's almost like a standalone app. They think of it like, oh, this is the particular problem we're solving. And previously, when they built that app, they were all thinking about, okay, well, this is the functionality of my app and what it does, and I'm not going to worry about the other things out there. And the problem that created was, yeah, it's great that your app does this very specific thing really well, but if it doesn't connect, to the rest of the tools that an organization is using, it's actually hard for people to really get the full value out of it. And so what you've now seen is more and more of these startups, more and more of these software companies, when they're building their app, they now think about integrating to platforms like HubSpot and Salesforce as one of the core features, of their product. I mean, so there's whatever functionality they're adding that new, but making sure that they integrate to HubSpot, Salesforce, Microsoft, so that their customers, their prospective customers, if they like that functionality, it can plug into their stack and actually be a part of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that is a change. 5 years ago, a lot of these apps, they kind of thought of integration as an afterthought, if they thought about it at all. And I think you're seeing now people treat that as like, yeah, sort of a core requirement of being successful.
I agree with you, because we see on our side as well, we integrate with other like HubSpot as well, and customers just refuse to use it, right? Your whatever nice value you try to provide, unless you plug into the place where the entire company data lives, and HubSpot has become one of the great players in this regard. But trying to kind of understand core drivers of growth of different apps, because I'm sure you were surprised yourself, right? 10 years ago, if somebody would tell you that MarTech would be 100x of what you just mapped, you would probably say that it's just insane. And now it's like a new normal. So what is the underlying drivers there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're absolutely right. Like if someone had told me when I was starting out mapping MarTech that like, oh, well, you're mapping 100 of them now, but you better be prepared to map 10,000 of them. I'm like, I'm not so sure I want to do this. The project definitely got much larger. But anyways, the way I look at it is it's basically about supply and demand. In order to have growth, you need to both be able to have a large supply and the forces to support that, but you also need there to be enough demand to provide revenue and economics for that. And so on the supply side, the big thing that changed over the past couple decades is it has just become there are basically no barriers to entry to creating software at this point. I mean, you can sign up with, Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud. They've got all these APIs, all this cloud infrastructure that is super cheap. It's, all priced, based on usage. So you don't pay until you actually, have growth. We have all these digital channels now by which we, can reach our prospective customers. Once upon a time, when you bought software, you had to like go through this very difficult process of, actually installing software on a physical computer with a data center. And, there were just all these things that now, like, if someone likes a piece of software in the cloud, very often they can sign up for a freemium or free trial account for a bunch of the software. The pricing model as a subscription as a service, they can put it on a credit card. And so this ability to build software quickly and cheaply, and then also be able to distribute and sell it with relatively low friction, at least compared to where we were 2 decades ago, is why on the supply side, we've seen this incredible explosion. But you still need the demand side, and this is where things have just been really interesting, is because marketing and how businesses engage with their audiences has just been going through such tremendous change. I mean, you think about, like marketing once upon a time, like there were only a handful of channels. Like it was like, oh, okay, well, we might run some advertising on TV. We might, have a trade show, put an ad in a magazine. And it was I mean, don't get me wrong, marketers did a lot of creative things in those channels, but sort of the scope of things they had to, build or channels they would use was relatively simple. Versus in today's world, right? I mean, you think about just all the different digital channels of, well, what's happening in our website and how people engage with it there, and what's happening on these different social media, channels, and, the way in which we like reach advertising, through like, oh, is it, podcast? Is it, what's happening, in a walled garden here and some other walled garden? And it's just been this like explosion of all these new ways to engage with customers, and they're still changing, right? I mean, like, what's one of the hot things people have been talking about recently is, the metaverse. And again, I think we're probably a little bit more hype than reality with metaverse at this point, but right, that is clearly another channel that's changing and evolving, and marketers are going to have to think about, oh, okay, how would we reach people, through that channel? How would we engage them? And anytime you have all these new changes and this new innovation and consumer patterns, are shifting, all of those things create opportunities for marketers to say, oh, well, okay, how can I do that? And so the software providers who are creating things, okay, we can create this app to help you do this and to do that. This is what keeps that industry so fluid, is there is both the supply side that you can build a lot of software and get it into market. And there's this demand side of, there's just so much variety and so much change and so much demand to differentiate, our brand, in this complex global, digital market, that those two forces combine to just create a lot of continuous fluidity to the MarTech industry.
It is a great explanation. Obviously, over the last 2 years, we had like a lot of investments flowing into technology markets, and obviously it sort of accelerated to some degree. But what is interesting as well, I was looking at the space of growth in your graph. It's reasonably steady, right? It's sort of growing with a steady pace over the last decade, and it's pretty astonishing and exciting, really. So somewhere in the middle of mapping this marketing, landscape, you met Brian Halligan. You both saw an opportunity, right? I love this HubSpot inception story, how HubSpot transformed into platform. Can you share a little bit more about that?
I was lucky to know Brian and Dharmesh when they were first starting HubSpot. So I got to, because we were all in the Boston community, and so I got to watch them build that company. And to their credit, they always had the intention of HubSpot becoming a platform. It's just there are certain steps you have to take. I mean, the number one thing that, actually creates momentum for a platform is you need to have a fairly large scale. You need to have a large install base, because if you don't have a large install base, there just isn't an incentive, for other companies to build things to that ecosystem, and so I think HubSpot, spent the first decade, of its life, very much building these really useful products that then lots of marketers adopted. They expanded that into sales and service, and so once it reached a certain scale, then it started to make sense to say, like, okay, this is a large enough install base that there should be incentive for other developers to either build or integrate products to it. And that's when HubSpot was ready to, make that shift and say, like, okay, let's actually start, putting the pieces together from a technical level, from a program level, to become a platform. And that's when I joined in 2017. And one of the things, I'll share this anecdote because to me, this was really telling. So over the years, as I kept doing iterations of that marketing technology landscape, I would very often find myself like either in an interview or on stage with, a leader in one of the large tech companies. And I would show them the landscape and I'd be like, okay, what do you see? When you look at this, what's your reaction? And I would say almost always the answer was pretty negative. It was like, oh, this is the bad world. Yeah, what we're trying to do is get rid of all that so you can buy our thing and you don't have to worry about that. It's almost like the classic fear, uncertainty, and doubt sales technique. I think actually a lot of like sales reps, from these other companies would use my landscape in their sales deck as a way of saying like, yes, this is the bad world. You just want to buy our stuff, which that strategy has clearly not worked because, the software has just continued to multiply. I remember when I showed the landscape, I was the very first interview I had with Brian to, when they were considering, who they would want to, help with this mission. I brought the landscape along. I showed him like, okay, Brian, when you look at this, what do you see? And without a moment's hesitation, like he said, opportunity. It was like this recognition that all these other companies who are innovating and creating and building things, we shouldn't be trying to get rid of them all. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's competitive overlap in all of these things, but instead of trying to get rid of them, is there a way we can actually like harness, that energy and like get more value by working together, which is the whole dynamics of platforms. And so, I don't know, that was when he said that answer, I'm like, okay, if you want me to join, I'm in. That is, in my opinion, the right way to look at it.
I loved professor in London Business School, Kostas Markidas, and he loves this, phrase about whether it's a threat or opportunity, and he's always saying it's a threat and opportunity, right? And I think it's so true, and I think you did like an amazing job transforming HubSpot into platform. Can you share like a few things that you learned over the last 5 years? If you would explain another CEO, what are the top 3 things to keep in mind when transforming tech products into platform? And tech products should have already some very strong following, right? Like you mentioned, but what other things should be true for this project to be successful?
I think first and foremost, you really do have to look at this as a two-sided market. That first and foremost, you want to make sure that your customers, or as you have more and more partners and integrators, your mutual joint customers, that the customers are winning, that you're solving for the joint customer need, because that is the engine, that keeps these things growing. But it's equally important to recognize that your partners, they're almost a kind of customer as well too. You really need to care for them. You really need to be in the mindset of how do I make my partners successful? There's this famous quote from Bill Gates, I think it was a few years ago, but someone had asked Bill Gates, like, what's your definition of a platform? And his answer was, oh, well, you're a platform when the people around you are making more money than you are, that there's more economic value that's being generated in the total ecosystem, than from the core platform company itself. And that's a big shift in how, like when a company's going from just selling its own products and, yep, this is all we really, our focus is our customer, our revenue, and that's it, to be like, oh, well, this isn't just our customer. It's now mutual customers in the ecosystem. And it's really important that that rest of the ecosystem be generating enormous economic value for themselves, because in the absence of that, like nobody actually wants to be in the ecosystem, right? It has to be, the incentive has to be there. So that's the super big lesson. I think the second lesson is you need to be comfortable with what Dharmesh has used this phrase, co-opetition, which is the idea that, there usually aren't black and white lines in this crazy software environment we're in of like, oh, are we strictly a complement or are we strictly a competitor? That very often you have software that it kind of overlaps in different ways. Like, well, it complements on these things and then it competes on these others. And so when you're just doing your own product, you tend to look at everything as competition. Like, okay, well, if it isn't us, then it's not us, and that's competitive. In a platform, you really have to be comfortable with like, listen, it's okay to have some of these competitive overlaps in an ecosystem, because part of what they're doing is they're providing enough choice and enough flexibility to customers that they're able to pick and choose what are the best solutions combined in that ecosystem, for their needs. And if you try and like squeeze out the competition or shut it out, at the end of the day, you're only hurting, yourself. You're like limiting, how your customers are going to be able to get the most value out of your platform. So you have to be comfortable like embracing a certain amount of, competition in the ecosystem. And then I think the third lesson, which is definitely not unique to, the platform journey, but just, it's worth stating, change is hard. Like changing the mindset, of a company from being purely a product or suite to being a company that really thinks, throughout its entire organization, from product to sales to, marketing, partnerships, to change that worldview, to have a platform ecosystem mindset. It's a big change, and so even if you like strategically decide like, okay, well, we can spend a few months and we can strategically decide this is what we want to do, I think you really have to be prepared to invest, a multi-year journey in how you like shift, the way the company thinks, the way the company operates, to embrace this sort of new life as a platform ecosystem.
That is amazing insight. Thank you so much. So you now 5 years in, you started with dozens of partners, I guess, and now how big is your ecosystem today? And like, I know that you are tracking average number of integration. What does it look like today?
So we have over 1,000 apps, that are now integrated with HubSpot, and that momentum is continuing to grow. I think for me, it's when I think of like an ecosystem, there's these two dimensions. One is just quantity. What is that diversity, of solutions that, are available in the ecosystem? But the other dimension that's super important is the quality. Making sure that, okay, when people say, do two pieces of software integrate with each other? It's a little bit of a trick question these days, because there's almost always some way in the cloud that you can get product A and product B to talk to each other. But there's an enormous difference in how rich and good and stable and like the use cases that can be solved, from that integration. And one of the things we did early on was sort of map out like, okay, well, how do we even think about what makes an integration deep, and it starts with like understanding at the data layer, is it just passing data blindly one way to the other, or is it like a two-way sync? What's the range of data that you're integrating? Then on top of that, you start to think about workflow, like how do we get things so that they, from a process perspective, can flow across multiple apps seamlessly. There's a level of, like the user interface, like for someone who's actually trying to use multiple products together, do they have to keep switching between like 5 different browser tabs, or, can you start to embed, key UI elements in the core platform? And then even at a level above that, when you think about governance, if I'm buying apps or integrations in a particular ecosystem, do I have the assurance that, okay, these things have been vetted, they're high quality, they meet certain compliance standards, And so when you look at that entire range, I think there's a lot of opportunity to not just have a large number of integrations, but to really make sure that those integrations are very high quality in the value they give customers.
Thousands products on the platform. That is phenomenal. You mentioned about company mindset change. I just want to really quickly double click on that. What are the things that you think true now about HubSpot within organization in terms of how people think versus it was a few years ago? What is a really platform kind of mindset shift?
I think the two big ones are on the product side and on the customer engagement side. So on the product side, yeah, it really comes down to saying, okay, it's not just about the things we build, but it's how do we provide the right extensibility points so that there's this open architecture that allows other people to add value on top of our foundation. And just purely from a product management or engineering perspective, this doesn't just automatically happen. You really do have to consciously, build that into how you're creating product. So there's that change. And then on the customer side, again, it's this really interesting shift that if you're a salesperson at a company that isn't selling a platform, it's, just selling its core product, basically, the last thing you want to do is have any conversation with the customer about any other piece of software. You're like, no, let's not worry about anything else. This is our software. Yeah, don't worry about that other thing. No, you don't need that. Because anytime you're talking about, bringing other things into the conversation, it's like, oh my goodness, is this going to slow down the momentum of this deal? Are we competing for the same budget with this other product? And so it's almost kind of standoffish. It's like, well, it's either our product or their product, like a zero-sum game. When you make the shift to selling as a platform, now you're starting to take a very different view where actually part of the value you are selling to the customer is not just the capability, the functionality that's in your product, but it's the fact that it works really well with some of these other products. And so when a customer brings up another product that they also want to use, rather than trying to push that off the table, you're like, oh, you're using that? Fantastic. They have a wonderful integration to our platform. Here's how these two things work together to get more value out of both of them. Again, it makes sense, but that is, when you think about it, that's a pretty significant change in how you approach your go-to-market.
Amazing job with growing this into suite of products and also a platform business. Let's zoom out and talk about the explosion of apps and in SaaS in general. So we just touched how it works in MarTech and HubSpot facilitates building a lot of stuff within its ecosystem. But I think you mentioned in one of your talks IDC is predicting that it's going to be 500 million apps. Right. And you have very clear way to explain how they're going to build on top of each other. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? How do you see the future unfolding into this tech explosion?
It's kind of wild. I keep going back to a phrase from 11 years ago, Mark Andreessen, right? The guy who created, the Netscape browser and one of the early pioneers of, the internet we have today. He had this editorial in the Wall Street Journal in 2011 where he said, software is eating the world. And it was this idea that as businesses just become more digital, as we become more digital in our lives, there's just all these things that, all of a sudden now we can create software that either does things for us or it's, helping to just how we operate in this new world. And he was right, but I think actually we all underestimated just the total scale of what that means. So that IDC report where they said they expected 500 million apps, to be created and deployed in the cloud by 2023, right? So the end of next year. But it's really important to recognize that a relatively small fraction of those are going to be commercially packaged solutions. So take the MarTech Landscape. It's pretty wild that, there are 10,000 solutions on that landscape. That's a lot. But I don't think we're going to see that become like a million solutions. It just, they're just, the economics isn't enough for that. What most of those 500 million apps are going to be are these custom apps that an individual business like builds for some particular process they're using internally, or frankly, things like their website, like a mobile app, that basically we are all creating software, as a way to just run our businesses and to run our lives and to, do that. And so that's where you get this like incredible explosion, of millions and millions of apps, the vast majority of which are custom created. And so you mentioned no code. Before, if you wanted to create an app, you had to be a software developer. You had to, develop these skills and learn JavaScript. And, while that's certainly doable, that's still a pretty big barrier. Like most people did not want to do that. And so in some ways that became the gating factor, in how much software there was in the world. But then these no-code platforms or low-code platforms that allow non-professional software developers to say like, oh, here's what I want to have happen. I mean, not something like super sophisticated. It's usually these are very simple tasks or very simple websites or apps like that. But I don't have to be a professional software developer to use one of these no-code tools to kind of build the specific thing I want, publish it, and start using it. And this, it's like having an exponential explosion in the number of quote-unquote apps that now get created. So like, for one example, there's a bunch of these no-code platforms, but one of them from Google is called AppSheet, I believe. Google AppSheet. And again, it's a very simple tool for letting like a power user, a business user, an ops person, a non-software developer, create a little app. They had something like 2 million apps have been created just with that one AppSheet, program alone. And again, don't get me wrong. A lot of those apps are very simple. I'm sure a lot of those apps are temporary, like they come and go for a specific purpose. But still, they kind of count as a piece of software, as an app that's out there in the world. And so, yeah, that's how both this no-code revolution is feeding into the great app explosion of just millions of apps out there in the universe.
You mentioned MarTech, right? This argument could be made that from 100 to 10,000 is like 100x growth, right? And essentially, if it's 10,000 to a million, another 100 years growth. Who knows? Maybe we're going to be mapping like a million MarTech tools in 10 years. Just kind of wild suggestion, of course. But I think what is also interesting is that this explosion of app from one hand and tightening privacy rules, or like trying to kind of figure out like how do we not expose users to like such a collection of their data, will probably lead to a collaboration between companies on data and customer data and all these partnerships and so on. What are your thoughts around that?
That is exactly the right question to be asking, because yes, there's the upside that we now have all this innovation and all this ability to create. But the other side of that is like, okay, how do we govern this? Like, how do we make sure that, all this explosion of apps, that things are adhering to the right compliance, that, we're able to make sure that we're unifying data and not fragmenting it. I mean, these are real challenges. This kind of goes back to, I was talking about that model of like, how we think about integrations. And we talked about data, workflow, UI, but we also talked about governance, because I think that's, it's an underappreciated value that an ecosystem can provide, is really helping to take that responsibility to make sure that, okay, if you are building things or buying things in a particular platform ecosystem, that the platform ecosystem has done the work to make sure that like, okay, these things meet a certain set of standards, they operate in a certain, like a common way, the data is being aggregated in a consistent fashion. That is super important. That is the only way that we are able to like get to a future where, yes, you can have a really large variety of software, but you're still able to like aggregate, data and workflow and governance consistently across it.
I found really interesting in one of your talks that you mentioned that big data would require big ops, right? Governance is very, very important, but also trying to get a sense of this data, trying to facilitate commercial decision, get some value of this data. How do you think company will solve this big ops challenge?
The short answer is I actually don't have all the answers on this. I feel like we're in a very early stage where, if we go back 10, 15 years when the term big data first, started to arise, is there were a lot of questions. I mean, we saw this volume, what's the volume, variety, velocity, this explosion of data that was new. There was no precedent for that. Like, we had no playbook of how to deal with that because the world just had never had such a situation before, and so it took us well over a good decade to figure out, oh my goodness, how do we even manage that? How do we get it, into a, common warehouses or data lakes, or, how do we deal with that volume cost effectively? And I think, while that's not been completely solved, we've sort of largely gotten our arms around that. Now, thanks to, again, all these cloud services, things like Snowflake or Redshift or, stuff like that, we're actually able to get our arms around the fact that, okay, there is this big data. But now the challenge has